This year, there's been a lot of articles or videos out there that basically go like this. The metaverse already exists, and it's Fortnite, Roblox, Old, Snow Crash, Second Life, The Office, Second Life again, VR chat, the entire concept of the internet, online games. I've even sort of done this myself with my exploration of one of the first social virtual worlds, Active Worlds. Of course, I tempered this by shying away from using the term metaverse, as previously I've done a video on why I'm just not a big fan of that term. Typically, these pieces of content follow a pretty cut and dry formula. Introduce the fact that people are spending a silly amount of money on the concept known as the metaverse, mention Mark Zuckerberg a few times, loosely gesture at 90s cyberpunk, and then talk about how this has all been done before, but better, by something. This gave me an idea. What if someone was to do a video like that, except the premise wasn't, this cool old thing was the metaverse but better and done years ago, but instead, the corporate metaverse that we are being sold right now was literally done, verbatim exactly the way pundits seem to want it, and that sucks, but also this place kinda sucked too. To be clear, when I say corporate metaverse, I mean the sort of place that someone like Matthew Ball would like. That is, not a place described by identity exploration, transhumanism, freedom, creativity, community, being unshackled from the limits of scarcity, avatar embodiment, or basically anything that anyone who has ever been interested in virtual worlds, previously known as the metaverse, over the last 2 decades is interested in. No. When I'm saying this place was the metaverse, think Decentraland or Sandbox. The sort of place that, oh god, revolutionized the payment and financial space, encouraging users to spend money on digital items that they can trade in the economy of the future. Like I said, I want to talk about a place that sucks. Does that seem weird? Cool. I'm going there. In a nutshell, there is a social virtual world program from the early 2000s that allowed you to talk to friends, play paintball, ride around on a hoverboard, dress up your avatar, that sort of thing. While relatively basic by today's standards, they let you have a pretty decent amount of customization for the time, allowing you to decorate your avatar in all manner of virtual clothes. More on that later. They're launched in October of 2003, after a 2-year long beta. Therein lies theirs first problem, and the most likely reason why you've probably not heard of it before. Another similar social 3D platform came out the same year, Second Life. As an old who was, well, there, I feel like it's worth pointing out at the time that before both these platforms launched, back when there was hype building for each of them, it was sort of a platform wars kind of deal. I don't know a lot of people who were around at that time and who are also active in this sort of niche who can verify what I'm about to say, but I guess you'll just have to trust me, bro. Both There and Second Life started with a bunch of acclaim. Both were getting major media attention, and depending on who you asked, both seemed to be the future of virtual worlds. As someone who spent way too much of their youth in active worlds, I can say with a great deal of certainty that there were extremely enthusiastic people waiting to get into these new places. They would regularly talk about what they were excited for and why. Both platforms would compete with each other in the public's consciousness for which one was coolest. The most common motivator pushing other people to these platforms was graphics. And I don't just mean the 3D stuff rendered on the screen. The UI in Active Worlds was, to put it lightly, the very definition of programmer art. Even in 2003, Active Worlds looked very, very old. By contrast, Second Life and there both seem futuristic, and like they were built for new hardware and broadband internet, which was rapidly becoming a thing. Where Second Life and there differed was in just what you could or couldn't do. Second Life was, in many ways, a spiritual successor to Active Worlds, wherein user-generated content was the prime attraction, even if it meant a clunky UI or an overwhelming amount of stuff you had to learn when you first joined. There, on the other hand, was stripped down, completely focused on the social experience. You could make stuff, but in a very limited way. In Second Life, you could design basically anything with very little exception. There's a slight but very important differentiator here. While in both you could make and buy stuff, and Second Life, the focus was on the making, and in there, it was on the buying. Philip Rosedale, the original CEO and founder of Linden Lab, described Second Life, then called Linden World, as built by the people who participate in it. The selling came later. The focus was creation. And there, however, it was the other way around. If you made stuff, it wasn't about creation, but money. This was emphasized by Theirs' PR team and the sort of stories they pushed to the press, like the one that you're seeing right now about a teenage girl who made a lot of their bucks. And there, you could only essentially furnish or design a house or clothes with a very limited scope. The flip side was that there was far, far easier to acclimate to. The controls were simple, and the world was easy to navigate. This was actually seen as a big plus at the time, and a big knock on Second Life. Popular Science seemed to think that there was a winner, according to their 2003 edition of Best of What's New.
For years, science fiction writers have tempted us with tales of lands that exist only in cyberspace, where you can create a spanking new virtual version of yourself and pursue an alternate existence. After 5 years of development, There Inc. has opened the virtual doors to such a world, and it makes online chat rooms seem as old as Grandma's Victrola.
There was a bit of an old media darling in the way that Second Life never was, appearing in not just tech magazines, but in USA Today and even the New York Times. The way Y2K era journalists talk about There is, to be honest, kind of adorable and also sort of basically exactly how you'd expect.
Nowadays, you can be entertained without a tangible product. I know because I spent more hours than I'd like to admit in the immersive 3D online fantasy world known as There, www.there.com. Subscriptions start at $5 a month after a $20 initiation fee. The idea behind this virtual getaway is to chat up other members who are fronted by sexily attired avatars. You can shoot paint guns, tour the beautiful surroundings in hovercraft or buggies, and engage in a variety of other activities as a prelude to friendship.
I don't think I can drop just a single line from the New York Times article, though, which is half an advertisement for There and half a profile of There Inc.'s first CEO, Tom Melker. The article begins by painting Melker as your prototypical dot-com boom Silicon Valley CEO, the nerdy, bullied kid in the garage who was seeking the ultimate wish fulfillment by building his dream world using his giant nerd brain. Melker is described as finding refuge in a text mud known as adventure, where he felt more comfortable than he did in school or something. This is before, of course, they relate later in the article that Melker was previously involved in another virtual world in the mid-90s that burned through $4.6 million in venture capital from the Rockefeller family, or completely crumbling into dust. Probably the biggest takeaway from this article is the most infamous 2 paragraphs about There, as partially spoken by its CEO.
An archetypal user of There is the woman who is in her 30s, single, really overweight, lives in a small town, Mr. Melcher said. She's quite verbal and bright. She feels trapped by her weight and location. She reads the New York Times and the New Yorker and Salon, and she wants to meet people who have her interests.
Now, I don't talk about my day job too much here, but as someone that does a little corporate messaging here or there, I don't know if those would have been my words. Something that becomes apparent in many of these interviews is how hard Their's team had to pitch themselves as something new and different, as well as how, even in the early 2000s, the ideas at play seemed old hat. In the New York Times article, it ends with cynicism about if There can really accomplish what they're doing, with the New York Times writer wondering what you can do in there that you can't just do anywhere else on the internet. It ends with Melker arguing that while previous similar programs had failed, that was only because people weren't ready for it yet, and There will allow people to experience superior graphics and social experiences without any focus on gaming and just hanging out. That hanging out was a core component of There, one that was harped on endlessly. There, after all, was pre-social network, and even pre-Web 2.0. There was no Twitter, no Facebook, MySpace wasn't even a twinkle in Tom's eye. The very concept of making friends on the internet was still in its infancy. And then there's There. Take this excerpt from a GameSpot interview.
Much of There's press has talked about the emphasis on socializing, even flirtation, in the There world. Do you see yourselves as a sort of virtual friendster, an online community where people can start relationships that extend into the real world?
Friendster has really brought a lot of attention to the idea of online socializing and social networks, which is great. The idea of creating and developing social networks is core to There. However, the way There goes about creating the social infrastructure for its members is much different. Social networks are not about dating, although people do date both online and offline in There. If we execute right, There is really a mass market online destination. Like any real-world community, we want diversity in the community and a balance of men and women. Women tend to stay longest in the product and more often become in-world leaders. Women have traditionally been an underserved market in online games, and we want There to change that.
Here you can start to see what made There different from something like Second Life.
Second Life's different than a game because there isn't any goal. And it has the very unusual property that everything in it is changeable and in fact is created by the people who are there, not by us, the company. In fact, we didn't build anything in this Second Life. It started out as just a small island with some trees on it.
Where Second Life's focus was on creation and building something, theirs was very much built around socializing, around making friends, and maybe even dating. While building a virtual social network like this was certainly unique, it wasn't what made There such a media curiosity. No, for that, we have to talk about what really ended up grabbing the headlines.
In a virtual world, you can buy and sell just about anything you can in the real world. Big-name companies have even started selling virtually, with the average There.com user spending $75 in the month of May.
When There was first launched, it wasn't compared to its past contemporaries like ActiveWorlds, but rather MMOs. While doing research for this video and reading through old articles about There's launch, my biggest surprise was seeing how often There was referred to as an MMO. This wasn't by the developers, mind you. Once again, they insisted on calling There a platform, place, or destination. No, this was exclusively by journalists. While I expected to see There mentioned alongside Second Life, I wasn't so much expecting them to be mentioned alongside The Sims Online, or even EverQuest. But they were, more so than almost anything else. This is often not just because of a technical or design detail, but because of something else about There. It required a monthly fee, a fairly novel thing at the time. That much, though, was understandable to the games writers covering There, but was less understandable and more of a curiosity was what truly made There unique. There bucks. All the cool things in There required There bucks, which was an in-game currency. If you wanted to customize your avatar, play games, or even get a hoverboard to travel around faster, you'd need to spend money. That, at the time, was a pretty massive difference between There and basically everywhere else. It's a pretty wild idea too when you think about it. This is the early 2000s, a mere few years after the dot-com bust. But truly, that you'd buy clothes for your avatar isn't the wildest thing, at least not to me. The wildest thing, going back, is seeing just how the developers of There saw this as part of the social fabric of the game they were building.
Actually, the real-world items in There make the community seem more real. We didn't try and invent another fantasy role-playing game. We tried to invent a place where you had real interactions and experiences. What does that mean? It means you experience emotions in-world. You have fun, you meet new people, and you have the thrill of discovery and/or the excitement of winning a race. If I can buy Nikes offline, why can't I buy them in-world? We get into debates all the time here now. What is the difference between items in There and real-world items? The items in There are real to the members who use them. Just because they aren't tangible doesn't mean they aren't real.
I feel like it's really hard not to get stuck on this quote, but I don't want it to live on its own. Instead, I want you to keep that in the back of your mind while listening to this snippet from an article in the MIT Technology Review.
The dune buggy racers are kicking up dirt on their way to the track. The hoverboards are flying. A surfer dude flirts with a raver in a halter top and neon green micro shorts. And Lexa, someone who has greeted me within seconds of my materialization, is offering to show me the way to the spa. "You look like you could use a makeover," she says. I don't take it personally. She's referring to my avatar, the character I've chosen to represent me on screen. Over at the spa, Lexa helps me reconfigure my avatar. A few clicks bring me to a full menu of options for modifying my appearance. I lengthen my nose and broaden my chin. With another click, I ditch my default khakis for a pair of Levi's. When I ask Lexa what she likes so much about being here and there, the The text of her answer fills the word balloon over her head without hesitation. It's the people, she says. Whoever is operating Lexa widens the avatar's eyes when she sees my new duds. Virtual apparel imparts real status, and since many of the people coming here want to meet others and want to be liked, they're inclined to get more cool stuff that will encourage people to like them, just as in real life.
There's something here between all of this that I feel like is just worth stepping back and, I don't know, bathing in. In the early 2000s, before widespread broadband, or all the things that you know as the modern internet, years before the metaverse craze, we have a system set up to basically sell people things for no other reason other than to get people oohing and ahhing at their avatars. We have the implication that, to be blunt, if you have a cool enough pants, some proto e-girl will want to fuck you. And perhaps crazier than even that is the sense that journalists seem into it, that they seem completely down with this. In 2003, I was 14 years old, and I'd recently stopped playing Active Worlds. I did not go to Second Life, and I did not go to there. Instead, I'd been playing Jedi Knight Academy, which would, in a weird way, take me both far away from and directly to virtual worlds. At this point in time, if I look back, I can't honestly say for sure that I was paying super attention to this sort of thing. I can't really remember if I thought that these sorts of reactions were dubious at the time. Yet, as 2022 me, I can absolutely say for sure that dubious is at least one of the words that comes to mind. Even divorcing myself from the barely almost 2 decades of experience playing video games since then, as well as working for a virtual world company, I can at least safely say that the phrase, "Wow, I can't wait to buy virtual Nikes so that internet girls will like me," makes me want to crawl into my bed and alternate screaming into my pillow and making a disgusting guttural noise as I yell cringe, cringe, cringe over and over, as if I'm trying to summon some kind of weird demon. All of these many words are basically just me saying that I find it at least a little Pollyannish to think that in a post.com boom world, and far before anyone had even suggested anything close to it, something like this could work, or even catch on. And work, nonetheless, is a main feature. And yet, commerce was the main differentiator between there and Second Life. Mind you, it wasn't that Second Life didn't allow you to buy things, but the system was different, more creative, and built around a sort of sense of making stuff with other people. There's also something to how the system was designed as well. And there, you could buy into the system, but you couldn't cash out. Something that was built into the DNA of there was the concept of an in-game economy, but not one in the sense that we see it today. And there, this economy was thought of in the sense that you buy in-world currency, as well as make in-world currency within there. Perhaps you could do certain activities or even sell some of your basic designs, but here's the thing. It's pretty murky whether there was any strong intent to let you then take that money and cash it out to the real world. I've spent a long time digging and it just doesn't seem to be there. The only thing I could sort of find was one mention on an external wiki years after the game launched. This isn't an official service, but one outside the bounds of the company, making a promise that they will cash the stuff out in there for you, that they will turn your their bucks into real dollars. But I couldn't find how it would work, and I don't know if it really did. So it's Stress from the future with a weird update. So I did a little bit more research and I ended up finding an article on CNN Money that was a reprint from something from Fortune Small Business. It was from 2004, and it was basically a tiny little print that said it was introducing a story about two developers that had made money or wanted to make money in there. The reason why I bring this up is because it seemingly says that people could take real money, change it into their bucks, and then take their bucks and give it into real money. But I can't really find much else on this. The only other thing I could find was the Fox affiliate story, which you've seen a couple times here, that basically shows this 19-year-old girl that made some money by selling stuff in there. But it's not really clear about how she made the money or what the process was or anything like that. So I don't know if there was an official process for it. Likewise, if I look at official documents for there, I can't find anything. What I was able to find was a bunch of forum posts, including this one from 2005 from a user that wanted to move their money from there to Second Life. Now, if there was an easy way to just turn your there bucks into dollars, then this would be pretty easy. But everyone's telling them to use third-party sites like IGE, same as if you made a lot of money, say in World of Warcraft, and wanted to sell your gold for real dollars. That's kind of surprising, but that's apparently what you had to do. Finally, I did find something from 2013 on theirs website, but that was long after their had shut down, and this is basically them rebooting it as a new company. So I wouldn't consider this to be what the original there had, but apparently as of 2013, you can sell items for US currency. So that's cool, I guess. But yeah, maybe you could have traded their bucks for US dollars originally, but I don't think you could have. Could be wrong, but I doubt it. If one thing is clear in this video so far, it should be that theirs killer feature, the thing that set it apart from everything else at the time, was its economy. At least, that's from the perspective of its executive team and any marketing material they pushed. Likewise, it should be evident that they really did not want to be seen as a game, nor did they want to be seen as attracting gamers, but instead an entirely different demographic. You can see the narrative they're trying to weave here. An online place for lonely people to go, dress up, and maybe make some new friends, all with a functional real-life economy that totally justifies your existence in this virtual world. Because after all, making Monopoly money to spend on hoverboards totally makes virtual worlds cool, neat, and innovative. It strikes me as mildly wild, in this small moment, that there existed as a past echo of the same mistakes many companies would make almost 2 decades later. And perhaps chief among those complaints is creating something that is perfectly parallel to things that already existed at the time, stripping out the parts that made them interesting and actually cool, and then retooling the worst and most annoying parts to appeal to some target audience that probably has never seen the thing you're copying in the first place. It's hard not to look at there and see an almost silly amount of parallels with many of the numerous Metaverse companies that have popped up in the last few years, even down to many of the design choices that seem to separate it from its competition at the time. There's real innovation is really microtransactions, not avatar customization or building your own home in cyberspace. A big pull for there was that you wouldn't be wearing jeans, you'd be wearing Levi's. You wouldn't be drinking a cola, you'd be drinking a Coke. You would be wearing Nikes, not some other silly off-brand gaming shoes. They weren't saying, let's give someone avatar customization and let them explore their identity. They were saying, let's let people own things in a virtual world to signal to others much in the same way they'd socially signal in real life. Sure, there's no crypto and NFTs, but there were their bucks, a digital currency used to purchase all of these virtual goods. In the same way, they're completely butchered the concept of building a home or community in cyberspace. In Active Worlds, there's predecessor, if you wanted to build your own house, you just would. You were only limited by your imagination. Even in Second Life, while you needed to acquire land, it felt like this was about smoothing out some of the chaos of virtual worlds. It felt like it had a purpose that went beyond monetization. But in there, you don't even own your land, you rent it. And there, you'd have to find a pre-built house, and then you'd sign a contract to rent it directly from the company. You'd then have to purchase furnishings for your house, or maybe you could win some by playing cards with your neighbors. It's like Animal Crossing crossed with Genshin Impact. It is utterly bizarre to me to look back at this almost 2 decades later for a bunch of interconnecting reasons. Obviously, the concept of buying digital goods isn't new or interesting now, but in 2003, it absolutely was. Almost bizarrely so. It's wild to read journalists fawning over buying Levi's for your avatar in a time when buying actual Levi's online was so new. It's almost unbelievable, and I mean that in a very literal sense. So just for a second, imagine taking that out there idea and then deciding that you were going to build an entire 3D chat program on it in 2003. I think the context of the now really adds to it. While this sort of thing is a little more acceptable today, it's still readily mocked, and I think for a pretty good reason. I was recently interviewed in Esquire on a story about virtual fashion and the metaverse. During that discussion, the concept of NFT clothing came up, or just metaversal clothing in general. Fashion is expression. With it, you can quickly communicate who you are to the world. Like I'm a dweeb. Like, yeah, in the real world, that expression is always a bit limited. You can't really be yourself when you have to worry about what other people think. If how you dress doesn't line up with your gender, or it's not appropriate, or it doesn't fit your climate, or maybe most importantly, can't afford it. All of those things have a limiting quality on your personal expression and what you can do with fashion. On the internet, especially in 3D social places, you are free from those boundaries. You can be anything. You can wear anything. And yet, it's in that context that folks have stood back, folded their arms, and gone, hey, what people really want to do is own things. It's so utterly bizarre to think that in the period that I'm writing this, places like Decentraland and Sandbox are being widely mocked for the very same sort of attitude. These places took one look at past and current virtual spaces that exist and essentially just tossed all the creativity and novelty to the side, somehow coming out the other end thinking that the most important part of a seemingly post-scarcity virtual world is owning something. And that's today, in 2023, in an era where people have gotten pretty used to spending money on the internet. 2 decades ago, the very idea of giving someone money over the internet was wild, let alone for virtual goods. The hubris of basically any metaverse platform today is wild, but in theirs era, it's almost unbelievable. To be clear, I don't think that there's anything wrong with, designers being paid. When someone in Second Life makes a piece of clothing for others to wear, or someone makes a model in VRChat, I think it's important that those people get paid for their labor. Yet, when a big fashion brand comes in, it feels like you aren't paying for their handiwork, but rather the opportunity to paste a digital logo on your avatar. I mean, at least with IRL fashion, outrageous pricing is justified by craftsmanship, aesthetic leadership, small product runs, and exotic materials. But here, in this 3D space, there is limitless possibility. And we're deciding to celebrate that by selling branded jean textures? Of course, none of this worked. It didn't work in there, and it isn't working now. It would be fair to say that in the last few months, the NFT market has just completely cratered. Just like with there, the creators of these new technologies seem to miss the part about people having to want to spend money before they spend money. You have to be making something desirable before actual humans want to buy it. There, as well as every metaverse, NFT, Web3 project or whatever, both fundamentally made the same mistake. Just didn't pause to try to understand why people dress up their avatars or spend time in these spaces. It's not just a peacock, it's because it's fun. It's expression in its purest form. It's finding your, you, and then hanging out with other people who are doing the same. Of course, we're spending an awful lot of time talking about fashion and identity, but that's not really the only problem there had. One major difference between there and Second Life was the amount of freedom they gave users in the first place. Second Life advertised itself as a sort of creative playground, whereas there was more of a theme park. Yeah, there's stuff to do, but you aren't going to be playing much of a role in figuring out exactly what there is to do. This disconnect in creative freedom was a huge departure from previous virtual worlds like Active Worlds. In Active Worlds, users were given a handful of basic creative tools and told to go do whatever they wanted. In my last video, I discussed how users in AW would make cities. There's no system to do that, it's just the tools let people make what they wanted, and, that's what they wanted to make. Sure, it wasn't as crazy as something like VRChat, but for the time it was impressive, and it allowed the community to build the world they wanted. The developers of there sidestepped all of this, believing that the real important part of these online social places was, the social part and not so much the creative part. And I mean, they're right, I think. But you can't gloss over the creative part too. And the fact that in basically every successful virtual world, letting the community figure out what is fun and then building whatever that happens to be is always going to be a better and smarter path to success than trying to guess at what it is and forcing people to do that thing. I mean, hell, look at something like Roblox even. Do you think that the CEO of Roblox knows what kids find fun? Child labor? I doubt it. But he does know that the kids know, and if you give them the tools to build stuff, they'll do it themselves. That stuff will be way more successful than anything you tried to build. There's developers didn't get that, and the end result was a world that feels not just dated, but not even like someone ever lived there. I've called there a corporate hellscape before, and that's honestly what it feels like. It's like a focus group tried to design something that was fun for people, and then let another focus group refine that work over and over until what you got was something that feels like somebody tried to design a virtual world based on stock photos. I get that same feeling from every metaverse space. Decentraland, for example, looks just like a field of billboards. It's an advertisement for a place, but that place is also just an advertisement. There's been so much written on this sort of thing that I feel like I'm not really breaking any new ground here. But I think it's fair to say that the most universal and striking thing about all of these places is that it's hard to imagine anyone not financially involved with them actually wanting to spend time here. See, the thing with virtual spaces is that build it and they will come is really not true. And it's never been true. No virtual space that has ever had any success has followed that maxim. Instead, the spaces that have succeeded, or are succeeding right now, have a different motto. Let them build it, and they'll stay. Would VRChat's developers have been able to predict that users wanted comfy core anime and furry spaces and raves? Probably not. But they didn't have to. The users did that themselves. When you allow people to find their own identity, their own space, you're giving them a place that feels like home. You're giving them exactly what they want. And the thing is, you'll probably never be able to predict what that is. In 2010, they're officially shut down, before being revived a little over a year later by then CEO Michael Wilson. It's unclear if this was always intended to be a temporary shutdown, although according to Wilson's LinkedIn page, their.com was closed because the slowing US economy made it impossible for companies and consumers to invest in virtual environments as entertainment, which I'm sure was news to Second Life. But then again, theirs founders and executives never really seemed to grok what made Second Life different. Earlier in this video, I mentioned Tom Melker, the guy quoted in New York Times about targeting a specific demographic. While the New York Times treats him as a founder, he really wasn't. The two founders of There were actually Will Harvey and Jeffrey Ventrella. Harvey is actually a pretty interesting guy. In addition to There, he also was a founder behind IMVU. Yet despite his success with that particular virtual world, his views on what made There work or not work are interesting. In an interview in 2010, shortly after There shut down, Harvey discussed what he thought happened to There.
There.com ultimately failed. It was a victim of its own vision, the expansive vision of creating a virtual world in which people could do everything that they could do in the real world. It's wonderful from the PR, recruiting, and morale standpoints. However, it has vulnerability from a startup perspective. If you have so much confidence in your long-term success, then you do not feel it is so incumbent upon you to have near-term customer validation. I had believed when starting a virtual world company that people would want to invest in having a virtual life. I thought that was true. But it was just an assumption. It turned out to be false. Only a very small number of people actually wanted to invest in a complete virtual life. Most of the people who had that predisposition were already playing massive multiplayer video games which were more entertaining than virtual worlds. The market was smaller than I thought. And in that smaller market, the competition was better in the entertainment factor.
I've spent a few thousand words talking about exactly what went wrong here, but it's interesting to see one of the company's founders more or less agree with me. Theirs team thought that people would buy things just because they would. In Harvey's mind, they're lost because MMOs were more fun. In short, they thought that they could figure out what was fun, and they couldn't. In another part of the interview, Harvey mentions their team being too rigid and unwilling to change, and he's probably right. One of the hallmarks of theirs more successful, or at least longer lasting competitors, is, once again, letting the community build their own fun. Because yeah, that's the whole point of a virtual world in the first place. That it took $40 million and 6 million lines of code for them to figure out that people go to these places to have fun and make things is something. But it's the next answer that I find the most interesting. The interviewer asked Harvey what Second Life did right. Essentially, if the market is so small and something like there can't work, why is Second Life having success?
I view Second Life in the same category as their.com. I don't think that their successes are all that different. While it is true that Second Life is in business, that does not mean it is profitable. The fundamental problems of the category apply equally to Second Life.
13 years after this interview, and Second Life is still going. I don't know if they are profitable, but whatever they're doing, it's enough to keep the lights on, and to keep many, many people happy. There, on the other hand, is really nothing more than a liminal space. Liminality is one of those concepts that has something of a concrete meaning in one social science, but has ended up becoming maybe one of the 2 or 3 most used concepts or ideas in basically any paper written by any given person on a small liberal arts college campus. Yet, once the term migrated to the internet, it had a tendency to mean places that give you a certain feeling of unease. Places that, no matter what they were created for when they were first made, feel totally lost in time now. Something isn't right, but there isn't anyone around to tell you what it is. There, to me, is an actual liminal space. It's a place of actual liminality, of transition, of being in between other spaces. I mean, even the name there conjures up something non-specific, someplace you go, but maybe only for a little time before going somewhere else. And yet, there was, and is. There still exists today. It's never really stopped existing since it first launched 2 decades ago, although the company itself did change hands a few times, and the servers temporarily went down when they did. It's worth mentioning here that the creators, original creators, barely stayed on for long enough to even see it out the door. They didn't even make it to the game's release, leaving right before the beta ended. But today, if you're watching this video, you can go create an account on there. You can go sign in. Just like ActiveWorlds, which I mentioned in a previous video, you can walk around and inhabit the world. The only difference is that, well, okay, I want to go on a bit of an aside here. I've never wanted to make a channel that's focused on negativity. That's just not the kind of thing I want to do. So now, I'd like to acknowledge what's left of there. Despite my criticism, there is a community here. Tucked away on Facebook groups and YouTube comment threads, you can still see that there meant something to people. There's even a long documentary that was released shortly after their first shut down. I think that's beautiful, honestly. There's something magical about this tiny community existing, despite how tucked away and hidden they might be. It's also interesting to see how absent the, for lack of a better term, corporate stuff is in this footage. There, as a company, might have pushed it, journalists might have ate it up, but the people that loved it clearly weren't in it for the Nikes. Yet, for the money and time invested in this product, for all the thirst over the metaverse and its history, no one ever came looking for there. Except me, I guess. And it really feels that way. And all the times I logged in to get footage for this video, I never saw another person. Not once. ActiveWorlds is older, looks even more dated. And yet, I can sign in right now and say hello to people. There are always people around, even almost 3 decades later. ActiveWorlds didn't have the investment money or the media interest that there did. While it's also remained a bit of a novelty, you can reliably find its fans on the internet if you just put up a beacon. Look at the last video that I made. Go look at the comments for it, or even in my Discord. There's people that immediately came through and talked about their stories. I'm not as confident that the same thing will happen for this video. And of course, then there's Second Life. There's competition. Second Life is very much not dead. It's so not dead that if I even joked about it being dead, my comments would be full of people telling me precisely how it isn't and how it's actually the first real metaverse, and how it was the first at everything, and that every other virtual world is just a bad copy. But there is a liminal virtual space, an evolutionary step, a variant of the digital world that no one bothered to stay in for very long, an abandoned mall in the suburbs that hasn't been bulldozed because somehow the Sears anchor store is still rotating people's tires. The original metaverses, the OG virtual spaces, were built with promise, hope, and bad code. They are the active worlds, the VRML spaces, the micro MMOs and MUDs that are invisible unless you're a niche hobbyist journalist or just someone with a questionable collection of gadgets living in the Bay Area. But those spaces had heart. They never really died. To this day, you can find their defenders. People still say hi to me in the comments of the Active Worlds video I made, thrilled to see something documented about their youth. Someone will archive those spaces. I mean, some people already have. But once you leave that space, that ambitious and certainly naive space of Gen X technophiles, you end up there. There was a vision of looking at all of that and just saying, we know more than those idiots. In doing so, they managed to somehow forget, ignore, or otherwise abandon everything that made early virtual worlds catnip to the truly tech-brained. Virtual worlds are playgrounds of identity, of creativity, of existing in another place, where you can create the rules, and to see all of that blink and somehow look right past it and say, but wouldn't you want to just be a landlord in cyberspace? Is honestly incredible. All startups have to pay the bills. People deserve to be paid for their labor making these beautiful places, these platforms. But generally, you've got to have substance before you can have profit. Sure, the dot-com boom proved that you can fool investors for a little bit. But you can only exist off venture capital for so long before the roof starts to cave in. That's what happened to there, with most anyone interested in this sort of thing choosing to populate Second Life instead. A place that was, no doubt, concerned about making money, but notably doing so on the backs of supporting creators and not lifestyle brands that meant nothing aesthetically or otherwise in this particular virtual world. The legacy of there will always be that quote about the target audience being a 30-year-old overweight lonely woman, a person just waiting to be exploited. It's interesting then that now, 20 years later, virtually the same thing is happening again, except the target has slightly changed into anyone that perceives the word metaverse as a code word for next gen, and not a massive red flag. There was, unquestionably, a failure. One that maybe should have been a warning sign to basically every metaverse startup that popped up in the last few years. But then again, that would require people to actually know about it. So I guess I can't be that mad. Because, after all, no one was or is there. Hello and welcome to my office. You probably noticed it's been a long time since I released a video. It's been over a year. So thank you. Thank you for being patient and sticking with me and sticking around. I really appreciate it. This past year was awful, and I'm glad it's over, and I'm glad that I am moving on. But yeah, I hope it's not going to be another year before the next piece of content I put out. I would like to do something about VR chat again. Or who knows? Who really knows? There's a lot of thoughts in my brain, and I'm hoping I can just get started working on something before, I don't know, I don't want it to be 2024 before I release another video. But yeah, once again, thank you so much. Thank you much for hanging around and commenting and watching the video. I really appreciate it. So yeah, join the Discord if you haven't already, and just thank you. Seriously.